Silas Miller, a widower barely surviving in rural countryside poverty, was patching his leaking roof when a violent storm rolled in. He thought he'd just weather it out like always, until his golden retriever mix, Buster, started barking frantically, clawing at the door toward the flooded ravine. Silas grabbed his lantern and followed. There, in an overturned accessible van being swallowed by rising floodwaters, he found a terrified woman trapped in her wheelchair. She said her driver had panicked and fled. But as Silas pulled her from the wreckage into his dilapidated shack, he realized something far more complicated than the storm was happening. This woman was hiding something, and his act of mercy was about to change everything. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The rain in this part of the countryside didn't just fall, it punished. It hammered the tin roofs of forgotten homesteads and turned dirt roads into rivers of mud that could swallow a truck whole. The levee upstream had been threatening to break for weeks, and tonight the sky had finally made good on its promise. Silas Miller stood on the sagging porch of his weather-beaten shack, one hand gripping the rotted railing, the other holding a patched tarp he'd been trying to secure over the latest roof leak. He was a man in his late 60s, his frame still strong but worn thin by decades of manual labor and lean meals. His silver hair was wild and unkempt, his face deeply lined by sun, wind, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle against poverty. His hands were gnarled and calloused, the knuckles swollen from arthritis, but they were steady. He wore layers of clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible, a faded denim work shirt under a stained canvas jacket, patched jeans held up with a length of rope, and boots whose soles had been re-glued more times than he could count. He was a man the world had forgotten, and he'd long since stopped expecting it to remember. But Silas had never forgotten what mattered. His late wife, Mary, taken by cancer 3 years ago when they couldn't afford the treatments. His grandson, Leo, brilliant and full of promise, but trapped working at Jimmy's garage because there was no money for college. The land beneath his feet, 40 acres of hard-scrabble earth that had been in the Miller family for 4 generations, now 2 months away from foreclosure. At his feet sat Buster. Buster was pushing 11 years old, a golden retriever mix with a coat that had faded from gold to cream, now matted and graying around his muzzle. He'd been Mary's dog, the one thing she'd asked Silas to keep when she knew she was dying. Where Silas was all sharp angles and tension, Buster was soft patience and unconditional loyalty. His brown eyes, clouded slightly with age, still watched Silas with the devotion of a creature who had chosen his person and would never waver. He was arthritic in his back legs, moved a little slower than he used to, but his heart was as fierce as ever. Together they were 2 old survivors holding on to each other in a world that had taken everything else. Silas tested the air. It tasted like metal and electricity, not just rain, but the kind of deluge that reshaped landscapes. The distant roar of the swollen creek was getting louder. "Leak's gonna get worse," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "But there's nothing more I can do about it tonight." Buster's ears suddenly pricked forward. Then he stood, stiff-legged, his hackles rising. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, something Silas hadn't heard from the gentle dog in years. "Buster, what is it, boy?" The dog began barking, sharp and frantic, pacing toward the edge of the porch and back, clawing at the door toward the flooded ravine. Silas grabbed the battery-powered lantern from the hook by the door. He'd lost power 2 hours ago and followed Buster into the storm. The rain was a wall of water, cold and relentless, soaking through his layers in seconds. Buster moved with surprising speed for his age, limping but determined, leading Silas down the muddy path toward the ravine where the old county road cut through his property. And then Silas saw it. A vehicle, sleek, expensive, wildly out of place, nose down in the embankment. Not a truck or a sedan, but some kind of modified luxury van, its back doors partially submerged in the rushing water. The headlights were still on, cutting pale beams through the rain. Silas stumbled down the slope, the mud sucking at his boots. Buster was already there, barking at the vehicle's side door. "Hello!" he shouted over the storm. "Anyone in there?" A muffled scream answered him. He wrenched the sliding door open. Inside, strapped into a wheelchair that was bolted to the van's floor, was a woman. She was in her 50s, drenched and shaking, her dark hair plastered to her face. Her eyes were wide with terror. The water was already up to the wheelchair's footrests, rising fast. "Help me," she gasped. "Please! The driver! He panicked! He ran!" Silas didn't hesitate. He climbed into the van, water up to his knees now, and started working the wheelchair's restraints with his arthritic fingers. They were high-tech, electronic, and completely useless without power. "Forget it," she said, voice tight. "Just get me out. Leave the chair." "Not leaving you or the chair," Silas grunted. He pulled a rusty multi-tool from his pocket and started prying at the bolts. Buster whined from the doorway, watching. The van shifted, groaned. The water surged higher. Finally, the last bolt gave way. Silas lifted the woman. She was lighter than he'd expected, her legs thin and motionless, and carried her out into the storm, with Buster leading the way back up toward the house. As they reached the porch, Silas heard the sickening crash of metal behind them. He turned just in time to see the van disappear completely into the swollen creek, swallowed by the darkness and the flood. The woman in his arms was shaking violently, and not just from cold. She was staring at the place where the van had been, her face unreadable. "You're safe now," Silas said quietly, grabbing a worn blanket from his bed. "Storm will pass by morning." The woman looked around the small, dim room, the patched walls, the buckets catching roof leaks, and the near-empty shelves, and something flickered in her eyes. Not disgust, something else, something calculating. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Eleanor Vance." The name meant nothing to Silas. He nodded and turned toward the stove to heat water for tea. He had no idea he just saved the 5th richest woman in America, and Eleanor had no intention of telling him. Not yet. 3 hours before the storm, Silas Miller had been sitting at his kitchen table counting coins. Not bills, coins. He'd spread them out in careful piles, quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, sorting them with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for important documents. The kitchen table itself was scarred and uneven, one leg propped up with a folded piece of cardboard that had once been a cereal box. The light overhead flickered occasionally, a reminder that the electrical system in the shack was held together by prayer and electrical tape. Buster lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, watching Silas with those patient brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. $11.63, Silas said out loud, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone. Talking to Buster was the closest thing he had to conversation most days. "That's what we got, boy. $11.63 until Leo gets paid on Friday." He'd already done the math in his head a dozen times, but he did it again anyway, because sometimes the numbers changed if you looked at them hard enough. They didn't. Wood for the stove cost $15 for a bundle that might last 3 days if he was careful. Propane for the small heater in the bedroom, the one he only used when it dropped below freezing, was $28 to refill the tank. Dog food for Buster was $12 for the cheap stuff that made Silas feel guilty every time he poured it into the bowl. The roof leak had started 2 weeks ago, a small drip above the kitchen sink that he'd ignored because he couldn't afford to fix it. Now it had spread to the bedroom, and last night he'd woken to water dripping on his bed. He'd moved the bed, put down a bucket, and told himself it would hold until spring. Spring was 4 months away. The foreclosure notice was tucked under a coffee mug on the counter, its official language a death sentence in bureaucratic prose. 2 months. That's what the bank had given him. 2 months to come up with $18,000, or lose the land that had been in his family since his great-grandfather had cleared it by hand. 18,000 might as well have been 18 million. Silas swept the coins back into the old tobacco tin he kept them in, the metal clinking with a sound that...
The can of soup had been sitting in the back of the cupboard for 3 weeks, saved for an emergency. Silas figured a stranger half frozen in his living room qualified. He worked slowly at the ancient gas stove, his hands still trembling from the rescue. The can opener slipped twice before he got it hooked properly. Chicken noodle, the cheap kind that was mostly broth and a few sad vegetables, but it was hot and it was food. Eleanor had changed into one of Mary's old nightgowns, the only dry clothing Silas had that might fit her, and sat wrapped in the quilt from his bed. Her wet clothes hung on a line he'd strung near the stove. The wheelchair sat by the door, water still dripping from its frame onto the floorboards. She watched him move around the kitchen with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity, exactly. Something more complicated. "You don't have to feed me," she said quietly. "I'll be fine until morning." "Nobody goes hungry in my house," Silas replied. It was something Mary used to say, back when there was more food to share. He poured the soup into 2 bowls, mismatched, chipped things that had survived decades of use, and carried them to the small table. He set the fuller bowl in front of Eleanor. His own held maybe a third as much, the broth thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl through it. "You're not eating?" Eleanor asked, glancing between the 2 portions. "Not that hungry," Silas lied. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and breakfast had been 2 pieces of toast with nothing on 'em. His stomach was eating itself, but he'd gone hungry before. He'd go hungry again. Storm always kills my appetite. Eleanor's eyes moved around the room, taking inventory. The buckets catching leaks, the near-empty shelves, the wood stove that was the only source of heat, the flickering light from a kerosene lamp because the power was out and probably wouldn't come back on for days. She picked up her spoon, but didn't eat immediately. "This is very kind of you." "It's just soup." "It's more than that." Her voice was soft. "It's the last of your food, isn't it?" Silas's jaw tightened. He hated being seen through, hated the exposure of his poverty laid bare for a stranger to examine. "I'll manage. Always do." "How long until—" "We don't need to talk about that." He cut her off, not unkindly, but firmly. "Eat while it's hot." Eleanor hesitated, then began to eat. Silas noticed she ate slowly, deliberately, making it last, like someone who understood the value of a meal, even if she'd never had to worry about where the next one was coming from. Buster lay between them, his head swiveling back and forth, as if watching a tennis match. When Silas scraped the bottom of his bowl, 3 spoonfuls, maybe 4, the dog whined softly. "Don't start," Silas muttered. "You got fed this morning." "Does he usually get more?" Eleanor asked. "He gets what we got." Silas stood and took the bowls to the sink, turning away from her scrutiny. Through the window, he could see nothing but darkness and rain. The storm wasn't letting up. They'd be trapped here together until morning at least, maybe longer if the roads washed out. Behind him, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Why did you risk your life for a complete stranger?" Silas didn't turn around. He stared at his reflection in the dark window, a tired old man in a house that was falling apart around him. Because someone would have done the same for my Mary if she'd needed it. I have to believe that. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Eleanor was quiet for a long time. When Silas finally turned back around, he saw something glistening on his cheeks that might have been tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "Thank you," she said. Silas just nodded and went to add another log to the fire. It was going to be a long night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a soft orange glow that made the shadows dance. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer violent, but relentless. Silas sat in the old armchair near the stove, his head resting on his knee. Eleanor remained on the couch, the quilt pulled up to her chin. The silence between them had stretched for nearly an hour. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but heavy with unspoken things. "My wife used to sit right where you are," Silas said finally, his voice rough. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words came anyway, pulled out by the firelight and the strange intimacy of two people trapped together in a storm. Every night after dinner, she'd work on her quilts. "That one you're under, she made that one. Took her 8 months. Eleanor's fingers traced the pattern of stitches, careful and deliberate. "It's beautiful work." She was good with her hands, better than me. Silas stared into the dying fire. Cancer took her 3 years ago. Started in her lungs, spread everywhere. Doctor said there were treatments, things they could try, but we couldn't afford it. Not the real treatments, not the ones that might have worked. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. "We chose between keeping the house and keeping her." The words came out flat, factual, as if he were reading someone else's tragedy. "Guess which one we picked. Didn't matter in the end. Lost her anyway. Now I'm going to lose the house too." Eleanor shifted slightly. "Your grandson, Leo, you mentioned him earlier." Silas's expression softened, just a fraction. "Smart as a whip, that boy. His mama, my daughter, she passed when he was 6, overdose, so Mary and I raised him. He'd sit at that table doing his homework, asking questions about everything, math, science, history. Got himself a full scholarship to state. Did you know that? Full ride. That's wonderful." He turned it down. Silas's jaw tightened. "Because someone had to take care of me after Mary died. Because someone had to work to bring in money. So now he changes oil at Jimmy's garage for $12 an hour when he should be in a classroom somewhere, becoming something more than what this place lets you be." "That wasn't his choice to make," Eleanor said softly. "Wasn't mine either, but here we are. He's 20 years old, should be studying engineering or medicine or whatever the hell he wants. Instead, he's trapped here because his grandfather is too proud and too poor to let him go. Just like I was trapped. Just like my father was trapped. This land," he gestured at the walls around them, 4 generations of millers breaking their backs on it. For what? So the bank can take it anyway? The fire popped softly. Buster sighed in his sleep. "You could sell it?" Eleanor suggested carefully. "To who? Nobody wants 40 acres of hard-scrabbled dirt and a shack that's falling apart, and even if they did, this is all I got left of her, of them. Mary's buried up on the hill behind the house, next to my parents, our daughter. If I lose this place, I lose them too." Eleanor's eyes were bright in the firelight. "What would you do if money wasn't an issue? If you could give Leo anything?" Silas laughed, a dry sound without humor. "I'd send him to school, pay every dime so he didn't have to work, didn't have to worry, let him be young and stupid and full of dreams like kids are supposed to be. Let him get out of here and never look back." "He loves you," Eleanor said. He'd look back. Maybe, but at least he'd have somewhere else to stand while he did it. Silas stood slowly, wincing as his back damage protested. You should get some sleep. I'll keep the fire going. Eleanor watched him move to the stove. This broken man in his falling down house who'd given her his last meal and his dead wife's bed, and felt something crack open in her chest. She said nothing. Not yet. But she would remember every word. Buster didn't come when Silas called him to bed. The old dog had positioned himself on the floor beside the couch, his body pressed against the side where Eleanor slept. His graying muzzle rested on his paws, but his eyes remained open, watchful in the dim light of the dying fire. "Buster," Silas whispered. "Come on, boy, let the lady rest." The dog's tail thumped once against the floorboards, but he didn't move. His breathing had synchronized with Eleanor's, rising and falling in the same steady rhythm. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head slightly, checking, then settle back down. Silas understood. Buster was Mary's dog first, and Mary had always gravitated toward anyone who needed help. The dog had inherited that instinct, that sense of who required watching over. Eleanor, paralyzed and stranded, vulnerable in a way that called to something deep in the animal's protective nature. "All right then," Silas murmured. "You stay if you need to." He retrieved the shotgun from the closet, Remington 870 that had belonged to his father, and checked the chamber out of habit. 2 shells.
The sound of helicopter rotors woke Silas just after 8. He jerked upright in the chair, the shotgun nearly sliding from his lap, his neck screaming from the awkward angle he'd slept in. Through the window, he saw a black helicopter settling into the muddy field beyond his property line, its downdraft flattening the wet grass. Eleanor was already awake, her face pale but composed. "They found me," she said quietly. Before Silas could respond, 3 SUVs came roaring up the dirt road, their tires throwing mud. They stopped in a formation that looked military, precise, and aggressive. Men in tactical gear emerged, moving with the kind of efficiency that made Silas's hand tighten on the shotgun. The front door burst open without a knock. Miss Vance, a man in his 40s, built like a linebacker and dressed in black combat gear, swept into the room. His eyes scanned the space with obvious disdain, the leaking roof, the threadbare furniture, the poverty evident in every corner. His gaze landed on Silas with something close to contempt. "Step away from her, now." "Excuse me?" Silas stood slowly, his back protesting. "Marcus, stop." Eleanor's voice carried authority, but the man ignored her. "You're the one who found her?" Marcus moved between Silas and Eleanor, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "I'm going to need to see some identification. And that gun, put it down. Slowly." "This is my home," Silas said, his voice steady, despite the anger building in his chest. "That's my shotgun, and you just kicked in my door." "Eleanor, stop." She said, "Stop." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Mr. Miller saved my life. He's not a threat." Marcus barely glanced at her. "With all due respect, ma'am, you've been missing for 14 hours. We don't know what happened here, who this man is, or what his intentions were." He pulled out a phone, taking photos of the room, of Silas, of everything. "This whole situation needs to be documented." 2 other men were already moving Eleanor, lifting her into her wheelchair with practiced efficiency. They worked around her as if she were cargo, checking her over with clinical detachment. "I'm fine," Eleanor protested. "Marcus, tell them I'm fine." "We'll let the doctors determine that." Marcus turned back to Silas. "You're going to need to come with us. Answer some questions." "The hell I am."
Silas set the shotgun against the wall carefully, deliberately. I pulled her out of a flooded van, fed her, kept her warm. You want to treat me like a criminal in my own house, you can get out. Sir, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I understand fine. Silas looked past Marcus to Eleanor, who was being wheeled toward the door. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Silas saw something there. Regret, maybe, or apology, but she said nothing, did nothing. The men moved with brutal efficiency, carrying her wheelchair down the porch steps, loading her into one of the SUVs. Buster barked frantically, trying to follow, but Silas grabbed his collar. Marcus paused at the doorway. You'll be hearing from our legal team. Standard procedure. Make sure your story stays consistent. He pulled out his wallet and tossed $300 bills onto the floor. For your trouble. The money landed in a puddle of rainwater that had leaked through the roof. Then they were gone. The SUVs roared away, the helicopter lifted off, and in less than 3 minutes, Eleanor Vance vanished from Silas's life as abruptly as she'd entered it. Silas stood in the doorway, staring at the mud-churned road. Buster whined at his feet, pressing against his leg. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas looked down on the wet bills on his floor. $300. Like he'd been a bellhop or a valet or some service to be paid off and forgotten. He'd shared his last meal with her, sat watch all night, told her about Mary, about Leo, about the things that mattered most, and she left without a word. He bent down slowly, picked up the money, and put it in the tobacco tin with his coins. $300 wouldn't save the house, wouldn't send Leo to school, wouldn't change anything that mattered, but it would buy wood for the stove. Silas closed the door, the one Marcus had kicked open, and noticed the frame was cracked. One more thing broken. One more thing he couldn't afford to fix. Just douse again, boy, he said to Buster. The dog looked at him with those knowing eyes, and Silas had to turn away. He'd been a fool to think any of it meant anything. 5 weeks after the storm, the roof finally gave up. A section above the bedroom collapsed in the night, letting in rain and cold air that turned the room uninhabitable. Silas dragged his mattress into the kitchen and slept there instead. Buster curled against his side for warmth. The $300 had lasted 2 weeks. Wood, dog food, a patch kit for the roof that proved useless once the real damage revealed itself. Now the tobacco tin held $4.18, and the foreclosure deadline had come and gone. The letter from the bank arrived on the Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff deputy who wouldn't meet Silas's eyes. 30 days to vacate. After that, they'd remove him by force if necessary. Silas sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice spread out in front of him, and tried to figure out how a man packed up 4 generations in 30 days. His grandfather's tools, rusted but still functional. His mother's china, 3 pieces left from a set of 12. The quilt Mary had made. The photographs in frames made from barnwood. What fit in a truck? What got left behind for strangers to haul away as trash? Silas carried the first load out to his truck, a 1987 Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles and an engine that started on the 3rd try, if you were lucky. The camper shell leaked, but it would provide some shelter. He'd slept in worse during his construction days. Buster followed him back and forth, his anxiety evident in the way he stayed underfoot, nearly tripping Silas on the porch steps. "It's all right, boy," he said, though it wasn't. "We'll manage." He'd called every rural property manager within 50 miles, looking for a place that would take an old man and an aging dog. The answer was always the same. No pats. First month, last month, and deposit. Amounts that might as well have been asking for the moon. The reality was simple. Come March 1st, Silas Miller would be homeless. He walked up the hill behind the house one last time, to where Mary was buried beneath a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. The grass had grown over her grave, wild and unkempt. He should have kept it better. "I'm sorry," he said to the cross, to the woman beneath it. "I tried. I really tried." The wind carried his words away, offering no absolution. When he came back down, Leo was sitting on the porch steps, his face red and blotchy. He'd been crying. "I got fired," Leo said without preamble. "Jimmy found out I was looking for a second job to help you. Said if I wasn't committed to the garage, I could leave. So now, we're both—" His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Grandpa." "It's not your fault," Silas said quietly. "Whose fault is it then?" Leo's voice was raw with anger. "That woman you saved? She never even called, never checked if you were okay. You gave her everything, and she just—" He stopped, unable to finish. I had nothing to say to that, because Leo was right. They sat in silence as the sun set, casting long shadows across land that 4 generations of Millers had worked and loved and lost. Tomorrow Silas would start living in his truck. Tonight he'd sleep one last time in the house where his wife died. The black Mercedes was so out of place on the muddy road that Silas thought at first it was lost. City car, city driver looking for directions back to civilization. He was carrying another box to the truck when the vehicle pulled up, pristine and gleaming despite the rural decay around it. A woman emerged, late 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Silas's truck, carrying a leather briefcase. She picked her way carefully across the mud in heels that had no business being anywhere near a farm.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Also like, comment where you are watching from, and share so your friends can enjoy too. And if you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out.